is Brent with Emotiva Audio, and in today's video, I'm going to walk you through how to configure your speaker preset in your XMC2 or your RMC level processor straight out of the box. And the purpose of today's video is to just do a basic setup and calibration of your speaker preset so that you can almost immediately enjoy the processor without having to do a more detailed calibration or run through the direct live process. To get started, we'll need to open up the menu of our processor and navigate to the setup portion of the menu in this left-hand column. Arrow over to the right to enter the setup menu where you'll see different sections, and of course we're wanting to navigate towards the speakers section, and then we'll arrow to the right to select one of our two presets. If this is your first preset you're setting up, and your primary preset, you'll probably want to use preset 1. We'll arrow to the right to enter all of the settings for preset number 1. And of course, under the name option, we can rename that preset. Say you could name it surround versus stereo, or any other name you choose. We'll just leave it as preset 1 for now. The first thing we need to do with our processor out of the box when configuring the speaker preset is to navigate to the size portion of the speaker preset menu. Once we enter the size portion of the menu, we will see that we have all of our speakers listed here, and by default, from a factory reset, they are all set as small with the center sub set as mono, and you can scroll through and see all of these defaults. Well, the first thing we need to do is to turn off or set to none any speaker channels that we are not using on our processor. This is important because, for example, if we tell the processor that I have width channels and leave small front widths as active, the processor will try to decode and distribute audio information to those channels which don't actually exist, and you will lose some audio information for any channels that are set as active but not actually connected to the processor. For this example, I'm going to set up a 7.2.4 speaker configuration. So I will have fronts and a center. I will have surrounds, which would be my side surrounds in a 7-channel setup. In a 5-channel bed surround setup, your surrounds would still act as your 4th and 5th channel. And then for 6th and 7th channels in my beds, I'm going to leave my rears also set to small. However, because I do not have width channels in a 7.2.4 configuration, I'm going to simply set those to none and tell the processor that I do not have any speakers or amplifiers connected to those channels. Because I'm using 4 height channels, I'm going to leave both my front height and rear heights as active. However, for my left and right sub output, notice that these are defaulted to small, top, middle. For the left-right sub outputs, I have the option to either configure these as the 5th and 6th height channels in my setup, or to use them as additional subwoofer outputs. For this example, I'm setting up a 7.2.4, so I will not need these to act as top middles. I will need this for a subwoofer output. And if I wanted to use both the left and the right sub outputs for my subwoofers, I would set these to dual mono. But in this example, I'm going to just set this to mono, which will only leave the left subwoofer output active. I'm going to then use the center sub output for my other subwoofer. And we'll get into some of the other options we have for our subwoofers and our height speakers here in a minute. But the important thing is that I have turned off my width channels because I will not have any speakers connected there. If I was only running a 5-channel bed, I would also want to set my rears to none as well. So from here, once I only have the speaker channels active that I'll actually be using, I can navigate to each of these sets of speakers and arrow to the right where I'll get the option to set them for some just as small to large. Some other channels have different options. Well, here, I am going to leave my front set to small. And I could set them to large. Large simply meaning that those speakers will receive a full range audio signal from their channel and that no bass will be sent to the subwoofers. I do want my subwoofers, because I'm going to set up 2, handling that low bass. So I'll set my fronts to small. When I select small for any speaker, I have the option to navigate to the right one more time. And here I can set the crossover frequency at which The fronts, in this case, will start sending their low bass to the subwoofer channels. In this case, 80 Hertz is always a good starting point. A good rule of thumb for your crossover is to look at the frequency response specs for your speaker that you're using. For example, if I have a speaker that's rated down to 50 Hertz as the low frequency roll-off, I want to overlap that by 10 to 20 Hertz up into that usable range. And so 50 Hertz, I would set the crossover at either 60 or 70 Hertz here. And then you'll want to go around and do that for the rest of your speakers. Of course, you can just leave all of the crossovers defaulted to 80 Hertz, or you can reset those all based on the ratings of your speakers. So there is another consideration we need to make when we're talking about our height speakers. When I navigate to my front and rear heights and arrow to the right, I have more options than just small or large. Of course, I do have small and large options in here, but I also get the distinction between top front or front height and top middle, etc. Here, because I'm going to use a 7.2.4, I want these to be front heights or top front speakers. The distinction being that we will use top front if it is a true in-ceiling speaker that's firing directly down at us, and we would use front height if these are speakers like our Emotiva A1 or A2 Plus speakers installed at the top corner of your wall and ceiling to directly fire down at you. And in either case, we typically assign these as small when we're talking about heights. And the default crossover frequency is 250 Hertz. I find that typically I like to set this a little bit lower, maybe closer to 150 Hertz. But again, basing that off of the frequency response of your speaker is always a good idea. And height channels don't often get a lot of low bass information regardless. So there's another consideration when setting up your height speakers, right? If I look at my rear heights, assuming I'm using height speakers like our A1 or A2, I would still want to set these as small rear heights. However, there is a configuration for height or Atmos speakers where they can point up at the ceiling, either from a module included on the top of a tower speaker, or like our A1 or A2 Plus speakers, sit on top of a tower speaker, fire up at the ceiling, and reflect the Atmos or height information down to the listener. In that case, before we even navigate to our front or rear height channels, we want to navigate to this Dolby reflective portion of the size menu. If you don't have any reflective Atmos type speakers, you will not need to activate any options in this menu. In this case, let's assume that both my front and rear heights are going to be reflective. And you'll notice I have three options: rears, fronts, and middles. This is telling the processor which of the physical outputs I am connecting these speakers to. And so because I'm using the front height outputs on the processor to connect to these channels, I'll mark the fronts. And then let's just mark the fronts and see what's happened to our speakers here. We'll notice that when I only mark one pair of reflective speakers, these are automatically assigned as Dolby-enabled middle height speakers. The idea being that even though those speakers may be connected to the front height outputs and at the front of your room, that audio will be directed up at the center of your ceiling and come back down to the listener from above from the middle of the room. And that is something that is put in place by Dolby and how we're required to set this up. When we are using the reflective option, we not only get a crossover frequency if we arrow to the right, we also get options for setting up the speaker height and the ceiling height. Both of these should be measured from the floor, and then for speaker height, from the floor to the height of the tweeter. For the ceiling height, simply the height from the floor to the ceiling. So the floor should be your reference point in either case. Let's say that instead of just one pair of reflective speakers, I'm actually using two for both my front and my rear heights. These are actually going to be reflective speakers. Well, if I also mark the rears, which again is just telling the processor I'm using the rear height outputs to connect to these speakers, you'll now notice that I get a little bit different behavior for these automatic assignments for my rear and front height speakers. Now I have a pair of Dolby enabled front and Dolby enabled rear. The idea now being that if you have two pairs of reflective speakers, all of that audio won't necessarily be coming from the middle, but will be distributed somewhat to the front and somewhat to the rear. And Dolby and the up mixer uses the speaker height, the ceiling height information to perform additional calculations for those reflective speakers. Again, if you do not have any reflective type speakers, if you only have direct firing speakers, either in ceiling speakers, they should just be assigned as tops. And of course, the direct firing speakers that are mounted on your wall up towards the ceiling would be assigned as height speakers. And in that case, we wouldn't want any of these options marked for our reflective speakers. We just want to assign them manually in the size menu. So at this point, so far, we have set to none any of our speakers that are not actually connected. And of course, now that I unmarked those reflective boxes, it defaulted these back to none, but we're gonna assume that we're using, let's say our A1 speakers installed at the front top corner of our ceiling and wall. So I'll set those to front height and also set the rear heights to small rear heights. Tops, again, would be if you're using a true in-ceiling speaker. And so now we need to talk about our subwoofer assignments. And I already have chosen for my two subwoofers to use the left subwoofer output with the left-right sub set to mono and still utilize the center sub output as opposed to the left and right sub set to dual mono. Effectively, this setup with both the left sub and the center sub set to mono is identical. However, I wanted to show that if you're using two subs and you have one, say the left sub set to mono, you get another option in your center sub to assign it as LFE. Now, if you're only using one sub, it's best to just leave this to mono. However, if you have a second sub that can catch the crossed over bass from your small speakers that we've already configured, we can tell the center sub to act as the LFE channel only, meaning it will not receive any of the crossover bass from your small speakers. It will only play the 0.1 track from a 5.1 or 7.1 bed format, for example. In most cases, it may be best to leave all subs set to mono so that they are both playing the crossover bass and the LFE information and sharing that duty. But in some cases, if you have subs of different capabilities that are placed differently in your room and you want to separate those duties, you will get the opportunity to set the center sub as LFE, but only if you have something else that can also act as a subwoofer to play the low bass from your other channels. There's one other option in the size menu that comes up fairly often, and that is a feature called Enhanced Bass. And we have not seen this feature pop up on our menu yet because it is only available when we set our front speakers to large. Once we set our fronts to large, we now see this new option called Enhanced Bass, which by default is unmarked. What this feature allows us to do is to tell the subwoofers to play along with the front speakers that are set to large, even if the subwoofer is not receiving information specific to the sub. For example, if I'm playing a 2-channel analog or 2.0 digital track through the processor, there is not a 0.1 for the subwoofer to play. Additionally, if the fronts are set to large, they will be playing all of the low bass and none of that bass will be getting sent to the sub via the crossover. So if we want the subwoofer to play when we're just sending 2 channels of information to the processor and we've told the front speakers to handle all of that information by setting them to large, we can mark the Enhanced Bass feature, which tells the subwoofer to play along with those fronts regardless of whether there is subwoofer information being sent directly to the subs. In order to adjust the crossover point at which the subwoofer starts playing along with the fronts, what we need to do is set the fronts back to small, navigate to the right, and say I only want the subwoofer to start playing at 50 Hertz and below. I set the crossover point for my fronts to 50 Hertz. Now, we're not going to leave them set to small. We're going to change them back to large, but the enhanced bass feature will pull from that small crossover point setting to tell the subwoofer when to start playing along with the fronts. And so the enhanced bass feature I find is best used when you are mostly playing 2-channel music content. If you use enhanced bass in a surround type setup, it can cause too much bass to be played, because typically with surround content there is information being sent to the subs already. Regardless, you can use enhanced bass to tell the subs to play along with your large front speakers, regardless of whether it has bass information being sent to it. At this point, we've covered most of the options available in the speaker size menu. The most important thing being to deactivate or set to none any speakers that you are not actually using in your system. We had to do that with our front width channels, and we would have done that with any other channels that we're not using in the system. We also covered assigning your reflective and other types of height speakers, as well as some basics of subwoofer settings, which you could get a lot more in depth into if needed. At this point, once we have told the processor what speakers are actually connected and given them their basic assignments depending on their installation and the type of content we want them to play back, the next most important thing we can do to do a basic configuration of the processor is to set up our distances. This is fairly self-explanatory. If we enter the distance portion of the speaker preset menu, we'll see a list of all of the speakers which we have configured in the size menu, for both right and left. And this is as simple as sitting in your main listening position and having a friend or family member run a tape measure out to the tweeter of each of these speakers. I say the tweeter not because it's extremely critical, but just to give you some place to shoot for. And then, from your listening position at around head height to the tweeter, you want to input that distance in either foot, inches, or in meters. And you can see that as I increase feet or inches, the meters increases automatically. And if I change the meter setting, you'll see foot, inches increase. So no need to do both. They kind of go hand in hand. And you'd want to do that for every single speaker. What this does is it tells the processor the distance of the speaker to the listener. And it allows the processor to build in some timing delays based on that distance so that all of the audio information arrives at the main listening position when it should, giving a more cohesive surround sound effect. Of course, I'm not going to do this for every speaker. Again, fairly self-explanatory to measure the distance from the main listening position towards the tweeter of each speaker and enter the distances in there. The third and final thing that we want to do when setting up our speaker preset is to navigate to the levels menu. And there are really two important things that we can accomplish in the levels menu, not only for setting up your speaker, but also as a very, very helpful troubleshooting tool if you're having an issue in your system. When we navigate into the levels menu and highlight each of our speakers listed there, the processor will begin to play a static pink noise test tone through the speaker that's highlighted. So the idea is that first, you should scroll through each of the channels listed, which we've already told the processor are present in the size menu, and with your amplifiers on and speakers connected, you need to verify that, for example, when you select the right rear speaker in the levels menu, that your physical right rear channel is actually playing the test tone. If the test tone is coming from a different speaker than the one you intend, this likely means that there's either a pre-out connection or a speaker connection that has been mixed up between channels, and you can use these internal generated test tones to ensure that all of your speakers are connected to the correct output and they are playing when they are supposed to. And so just doing a quick scroll through of all your speakers is the best thing to do first. Now, when you get to your subwoofers, I will give the advice to turn your subwoofers on if they have an auto sensing feature. Sometimes the test tones aren't quite at the signal level to get the subwoofers to click on out of the auto power standby mode. So just turning them on when you're playing test tones is a good idea to ensure it's not just the auto circuit preventing output. Once we get up and have ensured that all of our speakers are playing when they should, we have the option where we can adjust the level of the test tone that's being played. And it's not a decibel level. We just specify low, medium, or high. You can also turn that off if you want to. But typically, I advise to leave this on low at first. For most amplifier and speaker setups, low is an appropriate level of test tone. If you find it's a little low, maybe step it up to medium when you're doing this next step. But for here, I'm going to leave this on low. And to do a basic level calibration, what we want is for all of these speaker channels to be outputting at approximately the same decibel level from the main listening position. This will ensure that the system sounds balanced and that one speaker is not playing much louder than another, and again, provide a more cohesive surround effect. This is something that the Direct Live software can also do for you. I will advise that what I'm going to do here in the levels menu is different than how you should set up the levels if you plan to run Dirac. We have a separate tutorial video that walks through that process, but here we're just going to see about doing a basic level calibration. What I like to do is start with my left front speaker, typically one of my stronger, larger speakers that's going to output a nice tone. And using either even an inexpensive handheld SPL sound pressure level meter or an app on your smartphone. We like the app called Decibel X. There's both a free and a paid version. You can take a sound level measurement from your main listening position of the test tone that's playing from this speaker. For example, if I play my left front speaker and I use either my cell phone app or my SPL meter to take a reading, and it reads around 70 dB. Sometimes 75 dB is a number that's thrown out there. The number is not super critical. As long as it's somewhat in that range to give us a strong enough reading, I'll note the level that's being read from my left front speaker. For example, let's say it's 72 dB. And I can somewhat arbitrarily just choose 72 as a number that I'm shooting for the rest of my speakers. You could just as easily cut that output by a couple dB and choose 70, or boost it by a few dB and call it 75. The important thing is that we're picking one number to remain consistent throughout all of our measurements. So we'll stick with 72. And now I'm going to scroll through the rest of my channels and go to my center. And it will play a static pink noise test tone at some level. Whether that is higher or lower than the 72 dB that I read from my front speaker, let's say the center is reading at 70 dB, I would want to boost that by a couple dB in order to get it in level with my left front speaker. And then I'll go to the rest of my speakers, take a measurement, try to match it as close to the 72 dB as I can. Again, the final number is not important. What is important is that all of the speakers are outputting at relatively the same level when we play a test tone through them. By simply setting up your sizes, entering your distances, and doing a basic level calibration using the test tones, you can enjoy your system right out of the box in just a few minutes. I'll also say that, while I am level matching the speakers all to approximately the same reading, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's how you will want to enjoy your system. I typically find myself boosting my center channel by a few extra decibels just to hear a little bit more clarity of dialogue. I also find myself cutting my subwoofer a little bit. Sometimes we use the subwoofer test tones because they are a lower frequency. Inexpensive sound level meters can have a little bit more difficulty measuring their relative output. But the point being, use this to get close and then feel free to make adjustments by ear. What I find myself doing is using the trims buttons on the remote, say to trim up my center. And if I find that I'm very routinely putting a temporary trim of say 3 or 4 dB on my center channel when I'm listening, eventually I may just want to go back to the levels menu and make that a permanent adjustment here for my center speaker and apply a few more dB of boost. I find that's a really great way to get your system dialed in right out of the box. Of course, you have the Direct Live software available to you. This is going to say not available because we don't have the direct interface hooked up, but Direct Live will accomplish a lot of these same things for you. The purpose of this is just so you can do a quick calibration and speaker assignment, make sure all your speakers are connected appropriately, and go ahead and start playing some content and enjoying your system. You certainly don't have to go through the direct process to do so, but please view all of our resources on Direct Live if you do want to go through that process. Thanks for joining us today, and I hope this video was informative as you configure your speaker preset in your XMC2 or RMC processor. From all of us here at Emotiva, happy listening.